Alright, hey guys, so today we have another opening masterclass video for you guys. 31 ideas you must know in the Queen's Gambit Declined. This is one of the most solid openings that you can play against one d4, just to be clear how we got here, d4, d5, c4, e6. And with the Queen's Gambit Declined, or QGD for short, there's not very many concrete lines you need to learn, so it's very focused on the ideas. But with that being said, this video is going to be split up into 5 sections. There's going to be timestamps. We're going to be starting off some general sort of ideas which you should know, especially if you haven't played this opening before, with some sort of general overarching themes. But with that being said, let's get right into things. And so the very first idea I want to discuss, let's say we have developing moves from both sides here, knight f3, this is very kind of standard stuff, and usually the Queen's Gambit Declined is characterized by this move bishop e7, and further down the line we might have some developing moves for both sides, but there's this sort of lurking question that we have here of how to develop the queen side, right? This bishop for one thing on c8, it's obviously our bad bishop since we have pawns on light squares, so it's not completely obvious how to develop it compared to the Slav where the pawn is back on e6, usually we can bring the bishop out. In the Queen's Gambit Declined, it's a lot less sort of obvious, let's say. And there's also the problem of how do we develop our knight on b8. And a very common mistake which I see, especially below the under 1600 level, is developing this knight to the c6 square. I would say in about 99% of situations in any sort of given Queen's Gambit Declined position, developing the knight to c6 in front of the c-pawn like this is almost always a mistake. And the reason as to why this is bad is twofold here. The first is that sometimes you want to play c6 here and protect the d5 pawn like this, whereas when with the knight scene here, we can't do so, and the d5 pawn can potentially become a little bit weak. The other big reason is that in the Queen's Gambit Declined, one of our main breaks, as we're going to talk about several times throughout this video, is to push our pawn to c5 and counterattack the center like this, but we are limiting ourselves of our own potential to do so by once again putting our knight on the c6 square. I should also note back in this position here, instead of bishop e7, which is what we'd play in the Queen's Gambit Declined, bishop b4 is a bit of a different opening. This is called the Rogozin, where one of white's main lines is to actually play queen a4 check and force black to bring the knight to c6. And really think this through, right? White is spending a whole tempo here just to put black's knight on c6, which means that white is okay spending some time with their queen early on the opening, which generally they shouldn't do, just so black can put their knight on this positionally undesirable square. So doing it for free like this for our opponent is definitely not something we should be doing. So coming back to this position here, we talked a little bit about how, once again, knight c6, that's not a very good square. Very often we'd actually much rather have our knight on the d7 square. And this could be played immediately, but it also doesn't necessarily have to. The other question we should also ask, though, with regards to our queenside development, is what do we do with our bishop on c8? And naturally, very often, if our knight's going to be going to d7, well, then it kind of follows that our bishop should probably be going to, it can't really come to this square, of course, and even if it could, it doesn't really want to go there, it doesn't do much on d7. So what we should be doing is fianchettoing our queenside bishop like this, and sort of try to obtain a harmonious setup like this. This is called the Tartakower setup. Technically, a more accurate move order is going h6 first, and then b6, but once again, we're going to get into this in more detail a bit later. So another important theme that can occur in many variations in the Queen's Gambit Declined, say like in the bishop f4 variation or the bishop g5 one, is what does black do with their c-pawn here? Because I talked about how we don't really want to use our knight to blockade the c-pawn like this. We want to either put it on c6 to protect this or go c5, gaining more active counterplay. But how do you know which square to put the pawn on? And generally speaking, again, this is like a rough thing, but 95% of the time you're going to want to aim for c5. Generally speaking, the problem with c6 is this is sort of okay, but it's not in the spirit of the Queen's Gambit Declined here. This is sort of like a more passive version of actually a semi-Slav. Very often when black does play the semi-Slav, say in this position with c6, so we don't usually allow white to obtain a very simple setup where they get the bishop out to g5 and play e3 here, because most experienced semi-Slav players before white is able to play e3 will take this pawn on c4 and start to create a very messy position. But of course this is a topic for another video, which is why, for example, most of the time in these positions we will aim to play b6, bishop b7, knight bd7, and later on c5, gaining more direct counterplay in the center and not going into this more passive setup where we play with c6. And finally, the last general idea I want to talk about a little bit is when do we take this pawn on c4? And we just saw briefly, right, like in the semi-Slav, how in this position here, like we take on c4, like this is definitely something that can occur sometimes in many of these Queen's Gambit positions. But when exactly do we do so? That's a question worth asking. For example, if we follow the theory a little bit for a couple more moves, that's like very standard stuff for both sides, taking on c4 would be very premature here because, for one thing, white hasn't even developed their light squared bishop yet, and if they were to just simply take in one move, then they would of course be very happy, and it's not so smart from a time point of view for black to immediately take here. We'd much rather be in a position where white has already developed the bishop to d3, and I think even here people usually will play bishop b7, but if you want to take here on c4, this makes a lot more sense now rather than doing this right in this position where white hasn't even touched their bishop yet. So now for part 2 here, this is where we're really going to be starting to get into the real meat of the Queen's Gambit Declined here. We're going to start with part 2 by looking at this variation where white plays bishop g5, either here or with knight f3 and then bishop g5 here. It will usually just transpose very quickly. And this is probably the oldest, most classical main line of the Queen's Gambit Declined. White plays very logically, they bring the bishop out to its most forward active square, they continue to play e3, develop the bishop somewhere, castle short. As you can see, very logical play, it just makes a lot of sense to play like this. However, one question that you're often going to ask yourself when you play into these positions is, what do I do about this bishop on g5 here? Like, can I play h6 to kick it away or not? Or even the question, should I play a move like h6? Does this weaken my king side or something? And the general answer I'm going to give you is, yeah, you probably should play h6. Especially if you're going to play as I sort of recommend you to play, which is you often want to play b6 and just fianchetto the queenside bishop like this. But to show a brief line of theory to really understand why this is, and you don't need to fully understand this whole line here, but let's say b6 here, c takes d5. We don't want to play e takes d5 actually, we're going to discuss this more as well, but knight takes d5, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, knight takes d5, rook c1 here, putting the rook on the open file, creating some pressure as well on this pawn, bishop e6, bishop d3, and what black would love to play is this move c5, getting the pawn off of where it was vulnerable on c7, and now trying to launch our own play in the center and maybe even the queen side with going c4, b5 if white allows it. Often they go b3 though to stop c4. But the big problem with this, as some of you may have noticed already, is that white can just simply take this and then go queen c2, and now they attack the pawn on c5 but also the pawn on h7. But imagine if on this move here we had not played b6 immediately, we had played h6, and let's actually go down this rabbit hole where if we have all these same moves here, we play in the exact same fashion here, bishop e6. I should also note bishop b7 looks very natural, but the bishop is just ever so slightly better placed on e6, because on b7 is kind of just staring at this pawn, so we kind of change gears a little bit and put it on this diagonal, which would not be possible by the way if white did not make this exchange, which is another thing to take note of. But anyways, bishop d3 here, c5, and now if white goes for the exact same thing here, well, it simply doesn't really get anywhere because we can just like play a move at rook c8, knight d7, maybe even push the pawn to c4, and there's no pawn on h7 to capture. So for that reason, I generally recommend inserting h6 at this point. I should also note though that when you play h6 here, you do give your opponent this option of taking here as well as retreating, but these positions you shouldn't necessarily be too scared of. We do get the bishop pair here. There's some concrete theory, but very often black's game plan is going to consist of something like playing d takes c4, c5, opening this diagonal at some point. Sometimes we'll also play more solidly like c6, knight d7, but again, it's not something you should be too scared of. And coming back to this position, another very important idea is black playing knight e4 at some point, creating some sort of contact between these bishops, which will often result in a trade. And basically what black is looking for in that trade is to relieve some of the pressure that's on their position, given that white generally has the space advantage. And it's just important to understand that this sort of idea, it occurs very often throughout several variations in the bishop g5 Queen's Gambit Declined. And while I do recommend once again to play what we call the Tartacua variation with b6 here, there is another line where black even plays knight e4 immediately called the Lasca. The reason I don't really recommend this is because it generally tends to lead some like very dull sort of positions from the black perspective, which I don't really love. But nonetheless, we can't really discount the fact that once again this move knight e4, it pops up in a lot of variations, and you should always be on the lookout for whether something like this is working or not. And one thing that I really want you guys to keep in mind when you play the against the bishop g5 variation is your main plan, which is once again, like, you want to fianchetto the queenside bishop, but generally at some point you're going to have to break with a move like c5 here. And in fact, in this position, c5 is a perfectly playable move, simply just creating tension in the center. If white takes it, we'll just take back the b pawn probably. We don't really want to take the bishop because this pin here seems a little bit sketchy. We're perfectly fine taking here, and say if white just took again, I think we would be perfectly content here just taking back with the e pawn, creating these dangerous hanging pawns in the center here, which could be a powerful attacking asset even. So we shouldn't really be concerned about white ever just like taking a bunch of times in the center. And let's say white castles here will continue developing. We could put a knight on c6 here, but generally speaking here, the knight going to d7 feels a little bit harmonious, so it doesn't block off this bishop on the diagonal. And on the very next move, we'll actually see how this comes into action. Let's say white plays a move such as queen e2. This now allows black to play this nice move knight e4. Once again, using that idea that we saw from the Alaska variation, where if white ever tries to avoid this bishop trade, by the way, with bishop g3, we'll happily take the bishop like that and obtain the bishop pair. And of course, if white takes on e7, which is the most natural move here, we are also happily going into this variation as we have a very nice knight on e4. We're in no rush to ever take like this. We're very happy given that our bishop is protecting the knight like this, which allows us to maintain this outpost. At some point we'll probably bring the rooks to the center, maybe even play f5 to further reinforce the knight, but all in all, black is doing very solidly in this position. Also, I should note that in these positions, not only can you go for say knight e4, but you can also liquidate at some point if you really want to, and go for an isolated queen's pawn structure, such as the one we have in front of us right now. There's just one caution: this is a bit more of an advanced concept, but generally when you play against the IQP, you want to be a little bit careful about having your knight on d7, as this can lead to some more passive positions as opposed to when we have a knight on c6, which more directly puts pressure on this pawn on d4, and could even from c6 maybe go to b4, move the d5 where it can blockade the d5 pawn, whereas on d7 its role is a little bit less clear when we're playing against this IQP. And the final big idea I want to discuss in the bishop g5 variation, and there's not many I feel like you really need to know for this one actually, even though it's one of the main lines of the Queen's Gambit Declined, I do believe that you don't really need to know a whole lot to play it quite successfully, which again I think is one of the beauties of the Queen's Gambit Declined and just its nature of being a very solid opening. But okay, here, the idea I want to discuss is, let's say we go a little bit deeper back to this position in the Tartakoa, where white, they could take on d5 here. And this poses black a little bit of a question. What do we do about this pawn on d5? How do we recapture that? Okay, obviously we're not going to take the queen here, so it's between our knight and pawn. And the most natural move to many people would simply be to recapture with the pawn here, but this would actually be a bit of a mistake here. Generally speaking, whenever you have this bishop g5 variation and white takes on d5, you almost always want to play knight takes d5, because remember, it's similar to how we played knight e4 in like the Alaska variation here, where we seek these simplifications. When white plays c takes d5, they're more or less inviting us to play knight takes d5, creating contact between these bishops for free, and that isn't really something that we're going to turn down. If they just take here, we'll play queen takes e7, and we actually looked at these variations earlier where, you know, white plays rook c1, we go bishop e6, we go, you know, c5 in the next move, and it is once again for the reason of creating these piece trades to ease some of the pressure on our position that we usually play knight takes d5. And even say like a couple moves earlier, if white played c takes d5, again, we're not going to take here. We couldn't transpose the exchange variation. In this position, it would be a little bit better than taking, I think, here with the e-pawn. But nonetheless, the very best move in this position would be to play knight takes d5, when we'd happily see a bunch of exchanges like these, and we essentially just have a much improved version of the QGD exchange variation, since white has relieved a lot of the pressure on our position by once again making all these unnecessary exchanges. I also want to go a little bit deeper in the Tartakoa to really kind of further reinforce these ideas here. So let's say knight bd7, queen e2, c5, the typical break here. Let's say white takes here on d5. We could maybe take here, but I'm not a big fan. Knight takes d5 is the way to go. Create some contact between the bishops. White could avoid the trade here with something like bishop g3, But black is doing very solid here, and for example, we could even maybe take on d4, when white doesn't really want to play a move like e takes d4, because then that would give them an isolated queen's pawn, or if they play knight takes d4, then they would get also an isolated c pawn, which is probably even worse than the d pawn one, which would more or less compel white to play a move like knight takes d5, and after bishop d5 takes, I mean, this is pretty solid for both sides, I think. But if white did not play bishop g3 and played the more natural take-in here, after queen takes e7, knight takes d5, again, we're not going to play e takes d5, we're going to play bishop takes d5, not blocking the bishop on this diagonal here, keeping our pieces more active. And you might say, what if e4 here? I'm getting kicked around. Well, no problem, we go back to b7 here. It's just a single tempo. There's nothing that white can really do because they've exchanged a bunch of pieces off to make use of this kind of pawn push. In fact, they actually sort of now run the risk of maybe becoming a bit overextended because they can't really support these aggressive pawn advances. So for the third part in this video, I want to talk a little bit about what we call the exchange variation, which leads to a characteristic structure called the Carlsbad. And this is one of the most important variations. I've dedicated a lot of this video simply just to this one variation, because especially as you climb the ranks, a lot of repertoire books that people read are going to recommend this. A lot of people online are also going to tell people like to play this, because it's a very simple line and it has a lot of very simple kind of plans and ideas which are very appealing to people playing the white side of this opening. However, of course, there is sort of one drawback which has to be taken into account whenever white plays c takes d5 and we take back the pawn, which is that our bishop is being opened up on this diagonal. And if we're able to develop this bishop out, then very often, if we're able to do so safely, we have already equalized. I should also note sometimes the bishop can come to g4, but less so. f5 generally tends to be a bit of a better square controlling this important diagonal. And we're going to see later how bishop g4 sometimes can run into a bit of trouble. That is, of course, being that they are even able to get their bishop out to g4 in the first place. As if white plays like the most very accurate move orders by playing, say, like bishop g5, for example, here, and doing it like this. Say bishop g4, for example, in this position, we would just run into queen b3 here in this pawn. And that's another problem that we also run into with developing our bishop to f5. Again, queen b3 in this position would be very problematic attacking the b7 pawn. However, when this becomes more relevant is when our opponent picks a bit of an accurate move order to enter the exchange variation, and this happens a lot at the amateur level, where people put a knight on f3, for example, and then take on d5. The pressure on d5 that you get from playing knight c3 and then c takes d5 in that precise move order is absolutely crucial, because that is what prevents black from easily developing their light square bishop outside the pawn chain. Take this variation, for example, with knight c3, c6. If we played bishop f5 immediately, I think again this would probably run into queen b3 here, and this is a bit awkward to deal with. You never really want to play b6, by the way. It's just a very sort of weak structure to adopt here. We generally want a pawn on c6, a pawn back on b7, because now the d5 pawn's weak. If we play c6 like this, then the c6 pawn can become a bit weak, because again our pawn is advanced here and not on b7. And already after like bishop g5, for example, we can't just simply develop our bishop, because then we would simply lose a pawn on d5. But let's say we did go knight c3 here, c6, bishop g5. h6 is a very accurate move here, not for reasons that we discussed earlier. It's a little bit more concrete. And after bishop h4, here we're going to go bishop f5, develop our bishop outside the pawn chain like this. And if white just plays e3, we essentially get a very good version of the Queen's Gambit Declined exchange variation. We trade off the light squared bishops. This guy is often very difficult to develop, so if we're able to trade off like this very early on in the game, we are already happy. We have absolutely no problems in this position. However, again, when you play this move bishop f5, you have to be careful of these queen b3 ideas. And the reason we actually played h6 here is that now we can play g5. And this is getting a bit off topic, but it's just to sort of illustrate that we want to meet queen b3 with queen b6, but if we were to do so right now, then that would allow us to get double pawns, and this is probably something we want to avoid. Whereas by playing g5, bishop g3, now queen b6, we do not allow bishop takes f6, and we're not at all concerned about these double pawns here. These are very strong ones. We'll be able to weaponize, especially this one b6, by playing a move like b5, maybe b4 even at some point. And believe it or not, black is maybe already even slightly better. And for those really wondering as well what happens after queen b7, this is a very cool idea here with g8-4, queen a8 here, queen b6, we attack this, and the queen is almost trapped here on a8. This is incredibly dangerous for white to go into. So on a similar note of getting our light squared bishop out, so we looked at how, like, you know, there's these inaccurate move orders where if white puts a knight on f3 and plays like this, now taking is a bit inaccurate because we're often able to get our light squared bishop out a bit more easily. But say when white doesn't give us this luxury and they do play the most accurate move order, not with putting the knight on f3 very early on, immediately going for takes and bishop g5, not allowing black that luxury once again of getting the bishop to f5. I should also note that here if you go c6, bishop f5, this one doesn't run into queen b3 because again queen b6 but rather queen f3 here, and this is a variation which some grandmasters like to play for a draw where they have the bishop here but the doubled f pawns, but I have a very difficult time recommending any sort of variation like this to the average COD player. And of course, coming back to this position c6 e3, by the time we play bishop e7 and now we're finally ready to play bishop f5, white, they're not going to play a move like knight f3, they might, which is a mistake, because they allow bishop f5 then, they're going to play bishop d3 themselves here, stopping bishop f5 from black. But the real idea I wanted to show, I entered this for a slightly different move order. You can play this in various different ways, by the way. You could develop a knight to d7 first if you wanted to, then c6, bishop e7, there's a bunch of different move orders again. And in this particular case, I didn't actually mean to make this one of the ideas I was showing in this video, but just in case you guys don't know here, you can't really take on d5 here. This runs into knight takes d5, bishop takes d8, and bishop b4, and at the end of all this, black is actually just a piece up. But again, white probably won't take here, they'll probably know this trap exists, and after e3 here, now they're actually threatening this, which forces black to again play c6, bishop e7, and transpose into something normal. But anyways, let's say we get a normal looking position like this. We have knight bd7 here, castles, rook e8 where it exerts some pressure on the e file. And also, rook e8 has another very important function, which is that it allows this knight here on d7, which looks kind of like a bit of an awkward piece, to reroute to f8 now. And from here, the knight serves multiple functions. One is it protects h7, which might not seem so important right now, but as we're going to see throughout this video, it does play an important role. It could come to g6 potentially. Or, as we see here, there's an even more interesting idea, which is that sometimes knight can come to e6, kick this bishop away for a second. I mean, they don't really just want to take here unless they're winning material. Like, if they had a queen on d3 already, then they'd be happy to take. Unfortunately, that's not quite the case here, so they don't want to give the bishop pair up so easily. Bishop h4 is quite natural. g6 is the idea I wanted to show you, where, you know, usually you wouldn't want to make a weakening move like this on the king side so easily, but there's a very concrete idea in mind here, which is that, say, white continues playing very, like, forward fashion here, knight e5, maybe they want to go f4. Black can play this very sneaky move, knight to g7 now, utilizing once again the fact that we want to play this move bishop f5 to trade off the light squared bishops here. Also, just in general, get this bishop the hell off the board, because it's always a piece that's sort of like, you know, hiding in the corner, not really doing anything. Like, buddy, just get out of here, right? And now we are finally able to accomplish precisely this in the position we have right now. Say white plays f4, this would actually be a bit of a positional mistake, because after this trade, they've significantly weakened the light squares. Say they move the bishop, we can play this move knight e6. One of our knights is going to be getting into the e4 square, where it has a juicy outpost. We can play f6 next, kicking this knight away as well, which they unfortunately cannot do to our knight, because look at their pawns, they've overextended, and the black actually has a big positional advantage in this position. I should note, however, usually, I showed some like very subpar moves for white. They usually play more intentionally, at least the high level, with moves like queen c2, and after knight f8, something like rook a b1 to try to play b4. This is called a minority attack. We're going to talk about this very shortly, where to execute a plan like knight e6, g6, we can't do so in this position immediately, because then they would take here and go bishop takes h7 check, winning a pawn, which usually compels black to first play g6, and only then knight e6, since now takes does not win a pawn on h7. But briefly looking at this from the white perspective, one of the main sort of attractive plans that white has at their disposal, again coming back to this position, is a so-called minority attack here, where they just simply go for rook a b1, try to go b4, b5, take here, and create a sort of backward pawn which they can attack on the semi-open c file, and essentially try and gain a simple positional advantage like so. And we are going to talk about some ideas that black can use to sort of counter this, but to just briefly show what a good outcome for white would look like, it would be something like this: b4 here, a6, a4, We can stop it with one move, but white always has the other pawn coming in to reinforce the b5 break. Let's say bishop d7. This is a very passive move here. This is sort of like, you know, once again, we're trying to show what white is aiming for, not necessarily showing the best moves for black here. b5 takes. Black might try and activate a rook here, but ultimately will take and put a knight onto a4 and maybe c5 sometime in the future. Bring a rook to the c file at some point. And white just has a very solid positional advantage. We have this backward pawn to target. Black hasn't really gotten any sort of counterplay at all. Usually because their pawn structure is pointing this way, they'll want to somehow create an attack on the king side at the very least if they're going to allow these weaknesses. But as we've seen, like with passive this bishop d7 move, for example, they have not got anywhere close to even starting that sort of attack. However, now to show some ideas from the black perspective about how to deal with minority attack. It's not the scariest thing in the world, but you do really need to study some ideas to make sure that you don't just sort of get, I wouldn't want to say like outbooked, because it's not really like a theory thing, right? It's more just like knowing the ideas and then trying to implement them in the best way over the board. So rook a b1 is technically, theoretically, it's not considered the most critical move here. h3 is, white sort of wants to keep flexible. They don't necessarily want to commit to playing rook b1 yet. Sometimes they also like to go for knight e5 and go for f4, what we'd call a Pillsbury attack. But just to briefly show one reason why white can't go for knight e5 immediately, is that black has this very active counter-attacking move, knight g4, and if white has to take this, it's not really ideal because they didn't want to put a knight into the active square just to be traded off, right? Also, I should note they might take here first. And again, if takes, we're very happy to see this. And if they try to play the move f4, which is a move they really want to play, reinforcing the knight, well, unfortunately, they just drop the e3 pawn here. And now black has a decisive advantage, forking the two heavy pieces in this position. So like, yeah, that's one of the ideas of going h3 here to prepare this sort of Pillsbury attack. But again, even after g6 here, let's say knight e5, even like knight d7 in this position, trying to initiate these sort of trades, still keeps black in pretty good shape. Though coming back once again to that was a bit of a side tangent, but nonetheless, it's a very important idea you need to know if you're going to play the Queen's Gambit Declined, because this, if you honestly don't know how to deal with it, this can even be more scary than like the minority attack with some of the other plans we're going to look at later. So rook a b1 though, trying to play b4, let's say knight e6 here, bishop h4, a5, temporarily stopping b4, white often reinforces with a move like a3. And here, the game we're following right now is just a game I found on Lichess. It went knight d7, and after this exchange of bishops here, b4 takes, and black played this very unique looking move, b5. And the very first time I saw any sort of idea that resembled this one, I thought immediately there were like flags going off in my head, like this must be wrong, this must be wrong. Like, look at the pawn on c6 we're creating as a backward weakness. It looks absolutely atrocious. The square on c5 is also terribly weakened. But sometimes this move can actually be quite strong. But okay, how do you know whether or not to play a move such as b5 yourself? And there's a couple main criteria we're going to look at. So one is the pawn on c6. It is undoubtedly a weakness, but can our opponents really take advantage of that? If they can't, or if they can, I mean, obviously that's going to sway our decision a bit. Another is sort of linked in together with the weak c6 pawn is, can we clog up the c file with a knight going to b6 and c4? Maybe a knight will also be like on d6 and it can go to c4 that way. But if we can clog up the c file for knight on c4, that is always going to be a very difficult knight to remove, and it will also reduce the sort of chances our opponent have to put pressure on the c6 pawn. And the final one, and perhaps the most important, or maybe equally as important as the others, is can white play e4 here? And linked in with that is usually, well, if they can play e4, it's usually because we lack control over the e4 square. And in this position, that's actually precisely why b5 isn't such a good move, because white can play e4 safely, put pressure on the pawn here. And if black ever takes this, now our structure is somewhat collapsing here, and say maybe bishop takes e4 is quite unpleasant already. This is a threat. Knight takes b5 also is in the cards. Though in the game we're following, white played also quite imprecisely here, and they just brought the rook to the z file, which looks natural on the surface, but unfortunately after knight b6, knight e5, bishop b7, knight e2, the opponent wanted to, well, white here wanted to play, I think, probably e4, although it just doesn't really work at all at the moment because knight takes d4, hangs a pawn, so they figured maybe I'll go knight e2, and now go after knight c4. Well, unfortunately even here they can't really go e4 because still, like, knight takes d4, and that wins a pawn. So quite frankly, already in this position, black had achieved the dream. They got the knight to c4, there's no real pressure on the c file. This pawn on c6 is firmly protected by the bishop here, which sure, it looks like a bad bishop, but sometimes bad bishops protect good pawns. And if white ever tries to remove the knight on, by the way, in the meantime, we're probably going to like bring a rook to a4 maybe, the a file double up there, maybe knight out of e5 with f6 here. And if white ever dares to take this knight somehow, both recaptures have their benefits, but either way we recapture, undeniably we are going to get a very strong passed pawn here on the c4 square, which is going to be incredibly difficult for white to deal with. Another important method of playing against a minority attack we need to keep in mind is, once again, as I mentioned, because our pawn structure is pointing this way, very often we would like to be able to start some sort of attack on the king's side. And this game is a perfect example of doing so. Rook a b1 was played instead of h3, as we looked at in the last example. And here I'm not an expert on the theory, but I think knight g6 is one of the better options here, and you go bishop d6, and now you try to go for h6 here and make use of the fact that knight on g6 sort of controls the square, so we can just simply take it now, which often compels white to simply take on f6 here. But now in this sort of position, black is really ready to go with counterplay on the queen side, with again ideas like bishop g4, knight h4. This is an incredibly dangerous looking position for white. And in the game that we're looking at right now, we saw some similar ideas, but black rather didn't exactly implement it in the best way. So knight e4 here, we saw takes, b4 anyway, a6, knight g6, again bringing the knight towards the king side where it's ready to maybe leap and do some attacking stuff here, b5, takes, bishop g4. When white tried to play this move knight d2 to exchange off this knight on the e4 square, but unfortunately this backfired very quickly, as after knight takes d2, knight h4 here, white is already actually objectively like much worse, simply because we have like say queen h5 coming next, not to mention some nasty tactical tricks involving moves like bishop f3 or bishop h3, like say we go rook fc1 here, bishop h3 is already I believe winning, since if we take here, just knight f3, and if we try to instead as white play a move like bishop f1 here, seemingly keeping everything together, it doesn't quite hold, because after queen g5 we add pressure to this, and you once again can't push the pawn or anything as such, because just knight f3, we net the queen. So in the game, white tried to play this move king h1 here, so that now with a move like bishop h3 here, knight f3 isn't a fork. Unfortunately, this time there was a different trick to go knight f3, and if you take, of course, this leads to a forced mate after queen g5 now, so white tried to play queen d1, but with simply knight takes h2 here, we were winning material, and in short order, white had to resign. And so the final example I want to give on the minority attack is, it actually arises from a slightly different opening. It arises from Grunfeld here, where we have a very unique variation which transposes to a Carlsbad structure, albeit with the bishop on g7, so it's slightly different, but the idea was still very nice in this game here, where knight d7 happened, we play a6 here to prevent b5 for the meantime, a4, knight b6, c1, rook fc8 here, and in the game white played a5, and they didn't even bother going for b5 anymore. Though it's worth trying to understand what is going on after b5, and we're going to see some very nice ideas. Seemingly we're just allowing white to get in b5 for not really much in return, it seems at first, given that, you know, we can't play b5 to stop it, we've already kind of blown that window, and we don't necessarily have any clear attacking ideas on the king's side. But sometimes we can just allow b5 like this and get some very clear counterplay on the queen's side. One being that we could maybe just take for the a pawn and now play c5, and after d takes c5, rook c5, double up on the c file like so, and obtain some very active piece counterplay. We also, once again, because the bishop on g7, because the Grunfeld opening that was played in this game, this is playing a very nice role as well. Knight comes to c4, this bishop restricts a lot of options that white has. They can never bring a bishop to this diagonal or a rook here if they wanted to. Definitely white is very passive in this position, but also another one I like a lot is playing c takes b5, which looks a little bit counterintuitive, you know, capturing away from the sense here. But the idea is that now we can go a5, and we can play a4 in the next move and start to create a very dangerous, powerful passed pawn, which is actually not very easy for white to deal with. So we looked at a bunch of positions where white goes rook a b1, b4, they go for minority attack. But once again, there are also some other plans. We looked at the Pillsbury stuff earlier with knight e5. Once again, this is a bit premature because of knight g4. But what happens if maybe white is aiming for some plans with e4? This looks quite natural in a sense, and it's like, yeah, why not, I guess, right? But e4 in general is something which is almost never really good. The circumstances really have to line up for this e4 move to be good. Black say has to be a behind development for white's initiative to sort of turn into something, you know, for them opening up the center. But generally speaking, especially with the bishop on g5, this is just going to initiate a bunch of trades here. And after a position like this, we get a bishop onto e6, we can blockade the pawn fairly easily. Maybe we'll first play like queen d6 and double up on the e-file, bring a rook here before playing bishop d5. But this is exactly the problem that white runs into very often with the e4 break in the exchange variation. They just get these positions where a bunch of exchanges are made, they're left with an IQP, and because of the piece exchanges, they just don't really have a whole lot of dynamic potential in their position. So you should never really be too scared of something like e4. You just make a bunch of exchanges, try and play against the IQP, blockade things, and you should be doing fairly well most of the time. On the note of the e4 break, however, now we're going to look at a much better version of it, which was first sort of came up with by former world champion Michal Botvinnik, where in this game we're going to showcase right now. This was, I'm not sure if I have the date somewhere. Okay, I just checked, this game was played in 1952, around 70 years ago, where Botvinnik, instead of putting a knight on f3, which we've been looking at a lot so far in this video, he came up with the concept of putting the knight on e2 instead, and playing this plan where you go eventually with, he didn't play it in again, this was 1952, he was just sort of making up the concept at this time. Like in today's world, we would just play f3 immediately, but Botvinnik was sort of toying around with, maybe I'm going to go for the minority attack, but he sort of changes his mind eventually by going f3 here. And basically the opponent Paul Kara is again like a very strong grandmaster. Because of the time this was never really seen before, he didn't really know what he was doing. Botvinnik was able to demonstrate the sort of potential of this concept very nicely. Could he have played e4 here? Maybe, but Botvinnik sort of, he did it his own way. He played knight f5, he created some piece exchanges, but eventually he got through e5, he got pieces into very active squares, and this is just a very famous and well-known game of the sort of origin of this whole plan, the Queen's Gambit Declined exchange, where white goes for this sort of every plan, they eventually aim to go e4. So if you were to only have looked at the Botvinnik game we just showed there, it may give the impression to some people like this is some sort of invincible plan when white goes f3 and aims for this play in the center with e4. But this really could not be further from the truth here, and there are many different ideas which black has at their disposal to create counterplay against this plan. And the one I really want to focus on and show is one that's been brought to fruition by many strong players, and is one that many white players probably still haven't really caught onto yet. And it all starts with playing g6 in this position, which again is nothing special. I mean, there's like the whole 96 thing, which g6 prepares. And also I should note here of e4, by the way, immediately, white usually has to prepare this for some moves like rook a1 first, because if you go for e4 immediately, we take, go knight e6, we fork this and this. White, again, they do not want to take like this. They gave it the bishop pair, and there's still the pressure on this, which hasn't been solved. But if they go bishop e3 here, now we play knight g4, and now we put pressure on the bishop, which pretty much leaves white's only move to be like, they can't move the bishop backwards because then they just hang a pawn, so they probably have to play queen d2. But now we can actually just destroy white's pawn center very nicely with knight takes d4 here. There's probably some other moves as well, like maybe c5, I'm not too sure, but knight takes d4 seems like a very nice idea, where after knight takes d4 we play bishop c5, knight c2, bishop g4, and there's simply no way we can hold onto this sort of configuration without it collapsing. For example, if rook a1, we probably won't take this, as in bishop takes e2 and this guy's held onto. But after takes here, knight takes d4, all this stuff happening. White does have two pieces for the rook here, but they also have an isolated pawn, it's pin being awkward, rook coming to the d file next. I would say it's about equal, and also the b2 pawn is under a bit of pressure right now. So for this sort of general reason of like a quick knight e6, knight g4, especially knight g4, that's a key idea you need to remember, harassing this bishop. White does not want to play e4 immediately. They often instead play rook a d1. This is the most popular move, and after knight e6, bishop h4, where, as I mentioned earlier, knight g7 is a very common idea, trying to do some sort of bishop f5 stuff and trade off white's with bishops. However, the pawn on f3, I don't like this as much because after e4, it does feel a little bit awkward to me, and these pieces just don't really seem to make as much sense. The whole plan is just sort of not working. Which is why instead in this position, the concept I quite like is to play b5, which again, similar to what we saw against Minority Attack, it creates a very weak looking backward pawn. But our idea is basically to distract white away, especially this knight on c3, which controls like the e4 square, from the center where it controls like the e4 square, and we're just gonna like try and play b4, gain counterplay, kick the knight away, maybe play a5. Actually, a5, we don't want to play unless white plays, say, a move like a3, and then, okay, if we want to play b4, now we have to play a5. Whereas white allows us to get in b4 without us going to the effort of playing a5, we will happily do so. Sometimes we play some preparatory moves like this, so before going in for b4, let's say queen b1, now b4, queen coming into a5, very typical stuff here, attacking the knight, and it's a sort of crowning move which sort of finalizes our whole queenside plan, is to go c5. And now after some exchanges, we have very active pieces, we put pressure onto the e3 pawn, and if white plays a very natural looking knight d4, this actually isn't so great after simply takes, bishop a6, exchanging knights with bishops. Yes, we just gave white the bishop here, but now we're trading one of them off, and it's essentially going to be a good knight versus bad bishop sort of scenario, which gives black a big positional advantage, not to mention they have all these gaping weak squares in their position. And also coming back here, if e4 immediately, this would run into b4, knight a4, now takes, and we could maybe take on d4, but there's an even stronger move actually where black can play knight g4, as is very typical in many variations actually, to create contact between the bishops. Once again, you can't move the bishop back and then just knight e3, and look at how many pieces this is forking. So if you take here though, and rook takes e7, you still run into problems. Like, if it was just knight e3 and you could play queen d2, this would be good. But unfortunately, there's also the hanging d4 pawn, which gives black a big advantage in this position. So to summarize the whole f3 e4 theme for black, just remember, you can go knight e6 here. Don't try to go for the knight g7, bishop f5 stuff. It doesn't quite work as well. But b5, this is a very dangerous plan. A lot of white players don't know it. If you can get some sort of like bishop b7, rook c8, and go for b4, c5 eventually, you throw a queen out to a5 if needed when there's a knight, you will be golden. It's very difficult for white to start up the e4 whole plan when black plays like this. So coming back to what I discussed earlier, you know, we talked about these whole bishop g5 lines and how, generally speaking, black wants to play h6 because, you know, weak h7 pawn and stuff. But we haven't really seen a whole lot of h6 in the exchange variation. Well, we have it sometimes, but usually it's something we want to avoid. And I just really want to clarify that here in this small segment, because let's say in this position we play h6, we go down this sort of rabbit hole. A couple moves later, we see knight f3, rook e8, castles, and now we want to say play knight f8, rook a b1, and we actually struggle to really come up with something because, well, for one, knight e6 doesn't really gain a tempo anymore, and the whole g6, knight g7 thing, maybe we could do that, but combining g6 and h6, it's a bit weakening. And say another natural move to play knight g6 here and, you know, put the knight in the square, where, I mean, before when the bishop was in g5, it made a bit more sense, like, because then we'd play h6 and somewhat trap the bishop, or it'd be forced to give itself up and we'd gain the bishop pair at least. But now, unfortunately, I mean, at the very least, white can just win a pawn, but also it's like, they can even just play bishop g3 and keep the bishop on this diagonal, and we don't really get the bishop pair. And if neither of these ideas, like knight e6 or knight g6, are really appealing, it does make black's position a little bit depressing, and apparently we can play knight e4, but after simply bishop takes e7, queen takes, and b4, I'm not a big believer in black's position. For example, after knight g6, I believe just simply bishop takes, knight d2, and there's a fair amount of pressure on the e4 pawn, which makes it difficult for black to kind of focus on their own attack on the king side and really get something substantial going, whereas white once again has the whole minority attack thing that is still underway. So as a bit of a brief theoretical side tangent here, I've been focusing a lot on this video, like just simply castles, you go rook e8, knight f8, But there are some other interesting setups that you can sort of dabble in, where you can go h6 here. And again, I mentioned how you don't generally want to play h6 in the exchange variation, but if you have a concrete idea in mind for playing h6, that's when it can potentially be good. And one idea which I played quite a lot, and thanks to a book which I had read when I was 14 or 15 years old, called A Classical, well, 1D4D5, A Classical Repertoire, is written by this guy Nikos, an author who's written quite a few quality chess books. He recommended in this Queen's Gambit Declined repertoire to play knight h5. Again, trying to ease a bit of the pressure off on our position by exchanging bishops, but you do end up with a slightly odd looking knight on h5, but nonetheless, these positions actually do offer black a lot of solidity. Like for example, after castles, queen d2, one of my favorite ideas was that we'd often be able to actually, against this whole f3 e4 plan, make use of the fact that our knight's actually out of the way of the f pawn here and play f5. And I actually had several games where my opponents didn't play so well, and they actually allowed me to actually develop quite a nice like kingside attack eventually, like pushing the g pawn, maybe the f pawn. Granted, objectively, like in this position, white's supposed to be slightly better around there, but when I did play this, I always found it a bit of fun. And also when you go, say white doesn't play short castles, there's some interesting lines where they actually try to castle long, and basically what the idea is for black in these sorts of positions is you want to castle the exact same side as white. You don't really want to castle short and then white castles long. This is going to end up very ugly. You're going to get avalanched by these pawns. So usually you instead play knight b6, wait for white to commit their king. If they just play a waiting move, again, you don't castle short or anything. Sorry, not that. You just play bishop e6. If they castle short, now you castle short. If they castle long, now you castle long. And so while I haven't really gone out of my way to segment out any specific tactical ideas, this one in particular you should be very careful of, in my opinion. And I'm just going to grab this position here, where it didn't exactly arise via QGD exchange variation, but it eventually transposed into something that looks very similar like it, where the player on the black side, actually from Australia, guy around my age, pretty decent player, he's a FIDE master now. At the time of this game, he wasn't aware of this idea. He was already 2000 ELO at the time of this game, where he as black played knight h5, and his opponent, a very strong player again from Australia, played just simply knight takes d5 here, which at first looks just absolutely mind-blowing. Like, what the hell is knight takes d5, right? Like, can't we just take it? But this is the idea. Bishop c7 now, and because of the exact coordination of these pieces here, the black queen is trapped on d8, which in this position compelled black rather, play knight takes g3, and in the hopes that after h takes g3, they'll win a pawn. But unfortunately, we have the in-between check here with knight takes e7 after h takes g3. White was simply up a pawn, and this is a tactical idea which can actually occur a fair bit in the Queen's Gambit Declined, and you want to make sure you're not falling into this. Another position which this could occur in is one that looks quite familiar to us right now, but this time we're not going to see knight f8, but rather g6. And after rook a b1, perhaps knight e4 again. As basically if knight e4 here, then white would win a pawn with this whole sequence. If knight takes e4, I should also note here, if bishop takes g5, then this, and we win a queen pawn as such, which basically renders knight e4 just refuted in this position, and hence why some people may try to prepare knight e4 with this move g6. But unfortunately, let's say a move like rook b1, knight e4, white can ignore the trade with bishop f4, and in fact I think is probably best, when black's best is probably also to play this move knight f6, bishop f5 next, and maybe they're not doing too bad. However, a very common mistake in the database, and maybe the most common move actually, is for black to play f5. Unfortunately, again, if you remember the idea, we can play knight takes d5, and because of this coordination here with the black pieces, if they recapture, they simply lose their queen. And if they don't take, it's not even just we win a pawn, we're going to take here, we might even just go knight c7 next. Very, very disturbing stuff for black to deal with. And so finishing up here, again, another sort of like brief theoretical thing. You could go knight f6. This is what I sort of recommend. There are some people, however, who really detest these variations in the exchange here and do everything possible to avoid it. Personally, I've never really been that sort of person, but some people here will play bishop e7 with the idea that now after knight f3, knight f6, you'll get a normal QGD, and if c takes d5, now there's no bishop g5 stuff, but it comes at the cost. You get a different sort of exchange variation where white puts a bishop on f4, and to be honest, I've never really loved these positions so much from the black perspective. If we just play some more developing moves, white's bishop on f4 is actually quite well placed in my opinion. There's a lot of sort of ideas like knight e4 trying to exchange bishops, which we don't have at our disposal because instead of bishop being on g5, it's on f4 instead. And there's some more like concrete tries to utilize bishop being on f4, like trying to exchange it, but you make two moves with bishop, right? It's kind of ugly. And there's also ideas like in this position going bishop f5, developing the bishop out to a very active square, which if white just does like some normal developing moves is probably equal, but there's also some more critical tries like g4 and launching the pawns forward, which is kind of a bit scary. So I've never been a big fan of bishop e7, but just putting this out there, it's a possibility. It's yours for the taking if you are interested. Alright, hey guys, so I just took a bit of a break from recording. It was like well into 90 minutes. Hopefully on YouTube, as I edit it, it's going to be a little bit shorter, but nonetheless, here we are back, and for the fourth part here, we are going to be talking about the bishop f4 variations after bishop e7 and bishop f4. Arguably, this is, apart from like the exchange variation, probably the most kind of popular way that people play these days against the Queen's Gambit Declined. Bishop g5, this used to be like sort of the main line. But bishop f4 has kind of taken over in this position as the somewhat more critical approach, let's say. And by and large, the reason is because remember how, for example, there are a lot of variations where we'd play knight e4 when the bishop was in g5, would trade those guys off and would sort of relieve the pressure on our position like that. Well, in the bishop f4 variations, we can clearly see that we don't have that same possibility, and it's a lot more difficult to sort of relieve the pressure on our position by trading pieces like that. But the first real idea I want to discuss is going to be this idea where white often plays c5 at some point, and this is particularly prevalent in these bishop f4 variations, because when the bishop is on g5, it just doesn't really make as much sense. And maybe this is sort of an abstract thing in a way, but when the pawn is on c5 and the bishop's on f4, the pawn being there actually somewhat supports the bishop's role on this diagonal. I can't draw arrows to my life, there we go. And one of the main variations in which this occurs is after e3, and again, I'm going to recommend similar to against bishop g5 to go b6, somewhat playing the style of the Tartakower. And another main line is to go c5, where compared to when the bishop is on g5, after we take, if a bishop was on g5, then we would probably simply be losing the pawn on d5 due to the pin here, but that's not the case here because, again, the bishop is on f4. So clearly, there's some pros and some cons to the bishop being on f4. One of the cons is that black can try and play more directly in the center like this. That's not to say that black is immediately equal here. There's a lot of theory you need to know to make this stuff work if you're going to play it with black, which is why I prefer playing b6. But nonetheless, here let's briefly look at knight d7, and the idea basically is that black wants to be able to play c5 and recapture on c5 with the knight instead of the bishop. So white's sort of main line against this is to actually play c5, stopping black from playing c5 themselves, and it's not too easy for black to actually undermine this guy. And if black is not able to obtain some sort of counterplay in the center, like they'd like to play e5 or somehow b6, those are the two sort of main breaks that they'd like to go for when white has closed things up with c5. Obviously, e5 is sort of the principle, when your opponent plays on the flank, play in the center, but we have that well in control. And b6 is often met by b4, but in this exact position it's actually met by c6, and after knight b8, queen a4, and this is in fact a very difficult position that black has gotten themselves into already, which is why in this position here, black usually before they'll play b6 will play some sort of c6 pin, say h3 here, trying to preserve the bishop. One line that you sort of have to watch out for is white is knight h5, and in fact this is the main line actually, and white doesn't allow black to take the bishop here. I mean, we can't avoid it, but we at least get in return these doubled f pawns, which aren't really much of a weakness and in fact help kind of control the center and limit black's once again sort of active possibilities. The other sort of main approach was c6. So now after b6 here, white can't play c6 themselves, but still these positions are not the most pleasant thing to play in the world. White does indeed have a space advantage, and black is generally quite passive. But regardless of what move you play after e3, it is worth noting that, white could try and go for a similar thing on move 6 without playing e3 themselves. And it's important you understand just the general sort of flow that play will take here. So first of all, we'll go b6, and it's worth noting if white ever takes this, then this sort of exchange of pawns is just favorable for black. Here we exchange out, well, more or less a pawn for white c1, and next we're going to go c5, getting counterplay in the center. And if white plays b4 here, the most natural move, we once again strike in the center with a5. White will play a3. They would like to play a move like b5, but then they just hang this. They also don't really want to take or take here. They try to always kind of keep the pawn structure intact. And this is actually, I haven't done this much in this video, but it's worth taking to think. If you want to try and pause the video and figure out what you would do as black here, I really suggest you do so, because this is a tricky moment, right? And if you don't do something concrete, and we can punish white for the fact they haven't played e3, but we really need to do something concrete. Otherwise, white will consolidate their position, they'll just have a nice base advantage. So the basic move that black actually has at their disposal here, I'm not sure if basic's a word, but knight e4, counterattacking this knight, trying to destabilize white's position. And if we go knight takes e4, well, d takes e4, and this is already getting a bit tricky. Like, they can't obviously just go knight d2, because then they hang a pawn on d4, and if they go knight e5, we have a nice forcing continuation where we just take, queen takes a1, f6 here, kicking the knight away from e5 is quite important, and after knight c4, knight c6, and we're hitting both of these pawns, white's kind of busted. So some people will try and go queen c1 here, keeping the tension, but unfortunately, again, after a very forcing sequence here, we make a bunch of exchanges, knight c6, hitting this pawn on b4, which if they just push, I believe will play knight b4, and then there's this as a threat, also b takes c5, white's whole position is hanging, so queen b2 is a slightly more critical approach here, defending the pawn like this. And again, we don't want to just make a bunch of exchanges. Maybe we still have something, but if we're not careful, it could very quickly dissipate. So what we have to do is we have to destabilize white's defense of the d4 pawn by playing this move g5, attacking the bishop first of all, and it looks like it weakens our king side, but how is white going to punish that? They're way behind development. We have permission to go for something like this. So after this, we can make an exchange, take g4, this is going to fall after the knight moves. Absolutely terrible position for the white pieces. And just to extend the line a little bit further, there's actually a funny idea here after knight h2. If knight takes d4, maybe knight takes g4 and white gets counterplayed, so we can play e5 even, and after d takes e5, d4. And look, again, I want to be very clear, you don't need to memorize like this sort of line. You just need to know these sort of ideas, like, okay, for one b6, but knowing b6, a5 isn't really enough. You also need to know, like, knight e4, okay, at some point, like, knight c6, g5 to destabilize defense of d4. And if you know these ideas, again, in the game, you're going to have a much better chance at punishing this sort of move. Another very important idea in the bishop f4 variation is in many lines when white takes on d5, similar to what happens in the bishop g5 variations. Again, we don't want to play e takes d5, we instead want to play knight takes d5 instead. And again, with my recommended line of b6 here, that even means here we'll play knight takes d5. A very common mistake people make is playing e takes d5. Again, I don't really dig the whole b6 and d5 configuration, and I think we should avoid this by playing a move like knight takes d5. And even if knight takes d5 here, we're not going to play e takes d5, we're going to play queen takes d5, and to some people it's going to be like, ooh, scary, we're hanging our c7 pawn, but that's actually not really the case, and we're fine to give that pawn up, as we're going to look at very soon. And one important mental note to make here is that whenever we make this sort of exchange of knights and white goes through with it, because white hasn't yet completed development, like, for example, bishop b4 is actually quite dangerous in a sense, which is another sort of added reason as to why we want to play knight takes d5 and not just capture with the pawn, because these trades of knight actually have some sort of tactical benefit to black. Another variation, like, again, I don't really recommend knight bd7 because of the c5 stuff, but sometimes people won't play c5, they might play a move like a3, kind of waiting here. When after c5 takes, again, not e takes d5, knight takes d5, makes this exchange of knights here, and this sort of already puts a bit of pressure on white here. They can't easily just play a move like bishop d3, for example, because for one, actually, I think c4 is a bit of a problem, but another sort of issue is that queen a5 is quite annoying to deal with, which is why very often in these positions, white will play d takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop e5, a bit of an unnatural looking move, but they sort of have to do it to monitor this diagonal, no queen a5 check business now, also to sort of restrict bishop f6 possibilities. But in general, in these positions, black is around equal because their pieces are quite active. Also, this knight on c5, it's a little bit weirdly placed for when you have an IQP, but it does actually function quite well in this position. But nonetheless, here on the topic of b6 here, this is a move I recommend. A lot of similar ideas to the bishop g5 variations, so I want to avoid as much overlap as possible and really create some sort of specific insights for how to play this variation. Specifically, to start off with, it's worth looking at these variations of queen takes d5 as I just mentioned. Once again, we don't want to take on the pawn, we want to occupy the square with a piece, keep like this diagonal open. And first of all, it's worth sort of understanding some of the typical ideas for how black, plays when white just takes this pawn on c7, because if we do nothing, as often happens when our opponent just takes a pawn, we're just gonna lose, because that's how chess works. If you don't have anything concrete in return for your opponent's win of material, you're going to lose. So we need to quickly generate some counterplay. And as I mentioned, bishop b4 check earlier, good idea. Knight d2, not the best move okay, in this position it's the best move, but not a move they exactly want to play, right? Very backwards, not easy to develop this bishop now, because this is always a bit of an issue. For example, after knight c6, white, if they, okay, first of all, might look like they can sort of get away with this, but they really can't. You might think bishop f3 works, but after bishop takes d2 check here, if they take with the queen, they hang the bishop, and if they take with the king, they hang f2. So another idea is, we've talked about a couple times throughout this video, right? Like often you want to meet a bishop moving with something like d takes c4, and this is another scenario in which you want to do so. Here we can play d takes c4, and after bishop takes c4, bishop a6. And like, yeah, we could play bishop b7, but because we haven't also developed our bishop, it does make some sense to try and trade off white's, good bishop once again for our so-called bad one with this move bishop a6. Like if white tries to avoid the trade as such with such a move, they can't castle anymore, which will more or less always compel them to take. Sometimes they will keep the tension, but it's not a big deal. We can either take here and maybe go for a quick c5, or we could even just play queen c8 and continue keeping the tension ourselves. But nonetheless here, how does play typically develop when we go for such an approach with bishop a6? And what's usually going to happen, okay, white takes, we castle, but our knight is a little bit misplaced here. And if we're not careful, we might get a very sort of difficult position to play. For instance, if we played rook c8, queen a4 would be a very difficult move to face, since we have no real easy way to protect the knight here, and this actually just might lose a pawn. Which is why we're usually in these positions going to move our queen to c8 at some point and to b7 to keep an eye on this knight, and also use our queen to somewhat like fianchetto it and keep an eye on the knight squares. So c5 here is a natural move, queen e2, again, we're following the plan of queen b7, and then we bring our rooks to the center. And white doesn't have a very easy plan. They can't really use their pieces in an effective way very obviously. If they ever take, we take with our knight, bring it from the rather ugly looking a6 square into the center where it now controls e4. It can go there perhaps in the future. And from here, apart from maybe just exchanging pieces, we could try and play a6 b5 and make a little bit of progress on the queen side. And if white doesn't really give us what we're looking for by taking here and instead continues waiting, eventually at some point I think we can just take here. And after knight takes d4, knight c5, and again bring our knight into the c5 square. You might ask what happens if white does not allow us access. Well, I say now they have an isolated queen's pawn. After knight c7, bringing this knight to d5. This pawn, it can be a strength sometimes, but again in this position, especially if white squared bishop's already traded off, I reckon black actually is the one who is slightly better. And so the final concept I want to talk about in the bishop f4 variation is going to be, I learned it again from the book A Classical Repertoire on d4 d5 from Nikos, where he mentioned this pawn structure sometimes. Like, we're going to skip straight to this position, we're going to see how we got here very soon, where black's most natural looking move seems to be bishop takes c5, but Nikos actually says in the book that many players underestimate this pawn structure where people play b takes c5, giving themselves what he calls the 2QPI structure, I believe, which essentially stands for 2 as in 2, and Q is the queen side, and PI is pawn islands, essentially 2 pawn islands on the queen side we are creating by playing this. But even though statically this pawn structure looks a little bit off, it does provide a lot of dynamic potential for black with the open D, and well, the D file is already open, but also the B file. Like for example, one way that we could also, apart from just the B file, like bringing the queen to B6, rook here, is also to play something like knight D7, knight B6, which previously we could not do because a pawn was occupying that square. Now knight does actually target a lot of interesting squares from this b6 square. So for example, like after castles here, knight d7, queen e2, queen b6, knight f6 and bishop d5. This was a line given in the book here. Black occupies the d5 square very nicely. You can probably not bring a rook to b8 quite yet, but maybe just centralize rooks. And it's not exactly clear how white supposedly takes advantage of the fact that this pawn is weak on c5. Apart from just moving the rooks, maybe we could play rook fd8, but then because we protect the square, we can go knight e4 and bishop f6 perhaps, sort of improving the position a bit more. But looking at how this position arose here with b6, rook c1, again, you don't need to remember the theory so much, but just for your information here, a3, c5, bishop c4, queen d8 takes, and like, yeah, this looks very natural, but in this position, it's actually quite bad. Like, sometimes you have an option, but this time it straight up is just not good for black. For example, after castles here, knight e7, queen e2, black faces a very awkward situation actually, where it's very difficult for them to develop their pieces. Let's say they played rook c8, rook fd1, queen e7, they're going to play rook fd8 next, but whoops, b4, and our bishop is trapped. Of course, this is the idea. And even if we come back a couple moves, say, to this position, it isn't exactly clear, like, even knowing what white's threat is to go like rook d1, b4, maybe what we do. Maybe we have to play like queen e8, but after rook d1, it's like, you know, they're threatening this, and then knight e5. We really don't have any simple moves that we can make. Black genuinely is struggling from this position here after bishop takes c5. And there's a more general takeaway from this small segment we've just shown. It's that in symmetrical positions like the one we have right now, or at least in terms of the pawn structure, it's fairly symmetrical. The coordination of your pieces and also development are very significant factors and should not be underestimated. A lot of people just mistakenly assume these types of positions are just equal because they might look that way without really taking the concrete factors into consideration. So for the final part of this video, we are going to be talking about some sidelines here where white doesn't go bishop g5 or bishop f4, but rather goes something like e3 or even g3, somewhat playing in the style of the Catalan. The Catalan usually arises via this move order and is not appropriate for a video on the Queen's Gambit Declined because, quite frankly, it's really just a separate beast in of itself. I'll probably make more of a video from the white perspective on the Catalan at some point. But usually in the Catalan, white doesn't develop a knight c3 so early on, which does make this a slightly weird hybrid, but nonetheless black has to be careful. A lot of people when they play against Catalan make a mistake of playing way too passively and they'll play some sort of like style in the semi-Slav almost, but I really don't like this sort of passive setup. It's not necessarily terrible if you know what you're doing, but most people just play that way in autopilot and quite frankly don't know what they're doing. As an example, c6 here, castles, knight b7, queen d3, e4 here, and if you go bishop a6 or something, maybe it's not terrible. Even after that, I think white probably still has some sort of slight edge. But what most people do is they just like take a bunch of times in the center. I'm sorry here, what are we doing? D takes e4, this is what most people do. And they just sort of land themselves in a position like this, which is very passive, has very limited potential for counterplay since c5 isn't really something we can play right now. And okay, even after knight f6, say like maybe queen e2, c5, even in these sorts of positions, still white has like a nice initiative. They're a bit more ahead in development, slightly more active pieces. Not a whole lot of fun for black if I'm being honest. Which is why instead after bishop g2, I'm going to get you to play a move which you might not be so comfortable playing at the moment, but trust me, it's just a move you got to play here, d takes c4. When after castles, now we're not going to play a move like c6, because then after knight e5, we are simply losing the c4 pawn. We can't hold on to it. Like, for example, b5, knight takes c6 is possible, but even knight takes b5 is a pretty cool move. The whole point is that we now prevent these ideas of knight e5, and next we're going to go rook b8, b5, and protect this pawn. When we do have a bit of an unbalanced position, but definitely I think that black is the one who, if anyone is better, it's probably black just due to our extra pawn. If white goes e4, again, we're going to go rook b8. Let's say they go d5, they really are trying to go for it. Here we can just take here and go knight b4, a very typical idea. We attack this pawn and also maybe could go into d3 at some point here. Of course, b5 is also a move that we need to get around to playing. Although after castles here, bishop g2, d takes c4, aside from white castling, another very common move is, well, you might just be wondering, what if white plays knight e5 immediately? Because of course, you know, after castles, knight c6, now they don't have that option, and if they try to go knight d2, I mean, we just win a pawn. So like, yeah, knight e5, what do we do here? Because quite frankly, a lot of people just play a move like knight bd7 and after knight takes c4 just again play passive moves and wonder what they're doing, and the answer is not much, and they're struggling for life. This bishop can't get out easily, you can't play b6 because this hangs not a position you want to land yourself into. There's some more proactive approaches like c5, but one thing you have to be careful of in these positions is, again, you don't end up in some sort of symmetrical position like we were talking about earlier in the bishop f4 lines, where your pieces are just like a bit more passive than your opponents. White has the so-called Catalan bishop here, really putting in a lot of work on this diagonal, while our light square bishop is doing who knows what, which is precisely the situation you want to avoid. There's a very precise equalizing move for black in this position where you can play knight c6, but to be honest, even in these positions you still have to be quite precise, and when I see this variation from white, I know that they're sort of a positional player. They just want a nice, simple, calm game, and I don't really want to give them that. So a move that I quite like is queen d6, which at first sight makes absolutely zero sense. We are moving our queen to d6 where it blocks the bishop. It also gets under attack by this knight, and now we have to move back, it seems. But this is the whole point. Now we're going to play queen a6. White, they might play a move like b3, and we're going to play rook d8. And you might still sort of be looking at this, trying to make sense of it, like, Sam, like, what is this, right? But the whole point is that it's very, very difficult for black to actually just defend against threats like knight c6, c5, piling up pressure on this pawn, which gives black a lot of counterplay in this position. And that was, by the way, the whole idea of getting our queen out to this weird a6 square, simply to make way for the rook, so we can put pressure on the d file. And now after castle c5 here, we take, go knight c6, and we have a very nice position. And look, I know some of you are going to be like, Sam, this looks like some really weird theory, I shouldn't be memorizing this stuff. I totally get it. If that's not for you, you don't want to play a weird looking move like queen d6 because you don't want to play weird looking moves, you can play c5. But as you get stronger, people in these positions are really going to kind of grind you out. At the lower levels, you probably won't even face this though, so that's also worth keeping in mind. And now, speaking of levels and, you know, not facing lines and stuff, this line with e3 is a line, especially at lower levels, which I think you can face a lot. Generally, a lot of players, they don't really understand the importance of getting the bishop out, and they'll just see like, okay, I should protect pawn and develop bishop or something like that and hope for the best. Unfortunately, against the Queen's Gambit Declined, this sort of setup is very harmless. Well, fortunately for us, I guess, because a lot of people will play like this. So we castle, and there's a couple of different ways people can play. I think the best is when they go b3, but even that, as we'll see, not too dangerous. Against this early bishop d3 though, what we're going to do is, again, we're going to take, as we often do when a bishop comes out like this, play a6, and if white castles, we just play a very typical kind of fashion here of b5, bishop b7, and let's say, I don't know, some random move, we'll play knight bd7 and c5. If white plays a3 here we need to be slightly careful of b4, preventing c5. We're still doing okay here, just know what you're getting yourself into, right? Sometimes, a lot of people will play c5 here before white can stop us from doing that, and only then play bishop c5 when we get a very sort of symmetrical looking position. But it's just important to understand that we don't want to play knight c6 here, blocking this bishop off, as similar to some positions we've discussed earlier. Instead, we want to play knight bd7, keeping this bishop open diagonal, keeping the position more harmonious, and here black has an excellent position. Here we are doing perfectly fine. And similarly, I should note, if white stops us from playing b5, as they often will do with a move like a4, we can still play a similar line of b6, bishop b7, c5 anyway, knight bd7, we're doing pretty okay. Another sort of setup, apart from, say, bishop d3 or b3, which we still haven't discussed b3 yet, just to be clear, but c takes d5 is surprisingly common in the database I saw. And there's some big problems with this move, unfortunately. So, again, as we discussed earlier, the bishop g5 in the exchange variation, the bishop being there, often inhibits black from playing a move like bishop f5 very easily, because it, you know, indirectly puts pressure on the d5 pawn. Already that's missing, but more importantly is just the fact that when the bishop is on c1, it's just not really doing much in these sort of Carlsbad structures now, and black's just going to get a much better version of what we usually do. Okay, maybe not f5, but g4 the bishop can come out to. We could even play like knight b7 instead. that's possible and like just play it as normal, but you know, the bishop again is on c1. But I like bishop g4, and I mean, it's very difficult for white to deal with this pin here. A lot of people in the database even just brought the bishop back, which is kind of a bit sad. I think white's best is probably just to play a move like queen c2, but even here we can give double pawns to white, and I think that we definitely have some decent potential. If we can somehow like maneuver our knights around to the queen side, maybe sneak a queen around, that definitely looks quite promising. But let's say something instead like a3, trying to go for minority attack, just a general sort of taste for what we're aiming for here is knight d7, bishop d6, trying to activate our bishop on this diagonal to a more aggressive post, again compared to when the bishop on g5 and now bishop helps combat the pin, that is no longer necessary. So the bishop can come to here, and after b5, rook e8. This move is quite nice, prepares our knight to come to this active post on e4. And let's say after b takes c6, knight a4. Again, I'm showing some rather subpar moves for white, but it's just really to drive home the typical ideas for black. Like, don't get me wrong, it's somewhat typical, it's just like the timing's completely off, it doesn't appreciate even the subtleties of the position. And now after knight e4, a queen coming to f6, maybe to h6 very soon, pressure in h2, or like rook lift. There's any number of things that black could do, honestly. And of course, remember, this was all made possible and sponsored by this passive bishop on c1. But finally, the very last segment of this video, if you're actually still around at this point in the video, I'm extremely impressed, to be honest. Not many people watch until the very end. Props to you. That's dedication. But here, b3. Okay, this is the move that is very solid in my opinion. White essentially wants to play bishop d3 without having to move the bishop again. They want to be able to take back the b pawn in that sort of scenario. And again, as I've mentioned previous times throughout the video, c6, you don't really want to play it, especially here. This really does this transpose into a semi-Slav where, again, we've played our bishop to a passive e7 square, and it'd rather much be on d6. So what I think black should do is just counterattack immediately in the center with c5. And let's say a very common continuation is bishop b2. You immediately snap on d4, and if white recaptures back with the pawn, we're just going to play knight c6, b6, bishop b7, and play against this isolated queen's pawn in the long run. And also say if white like ever takes here on d5, we're going to play his intermediate c takes d4, which I really like. When it's worth noting that this b3 move, it actually can cause a bit of trouble for white after some exchanges as such, where they're actually behind development. Black is ahead because we've castled already. We can bring a rook to the d file. They can't easily develop the bishop because g2. They can't easily bring a bishop to b2 because then b4, or bishop b4 check rather. So long story short, there's a lot of just concrete factors that make this whole sort of exchange not so beneficial for white. And of course, we don't really want to take like this, because knight takes d5. Now we have a very good IQP situation. Or even e takes d5 and trying to immediately put pressure on white like this on the e file. Even this is quite good. Anyways, that just about marks the end of the video. Thanks for sticking around till the end. It's very impressive. This is like a 1+ hour video. This might even be my longest video on the channel to date, actually. But with that being said, you know, the usual, like, subscribe if you're not already, and share the video with anyone you think might find it useful. But otherwise, some other things, you know, I'll leave a link to my newsletter down in the description below. That's free, and coaching if you're interested in that. I haven't plugged out a whole lot on this channel, but I do offer coaching, so if you're interested in that, check that out in the description below. There's a form you can fill in. But I hope you guys, you know, have a good day, and you know, I'll see you until next time.